My dad promised me 40% of his $5.2 million company for 8 years of slave wages, then gave it all to my gambling addict brother at his retirement party in front of 200 people. So I pulled out a manila envelope and changed everything.
The family business betrayal. I built their empire, then I burnt it down. I'm Marcus, 30 years old, and on the night of my father's retirement gala, the event I spent 11 weeks planning, the one with the engraved centerpieces I personally sourced from a vendor in Savannah, Georgia, my father stood up in front of 200 guests, raised a glass of Veuve Clicquot that I had ordered and paid for, and announced that he was transferring 100% of Caldwell and Sons Contracting, a company appraised at $5.2 million, to my brother Darius, who once called me at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night to ask me how to set up a direct deposit. I didn't cry. I didn't flip a table. I didn't even loosen my tie. I picked up my champagne flute, took a measured sip, and I smiled, because I had been carrying a manila envelope in my breast pocket for exactly 6 weeks, and every single person in that room was about to have the best and worst night of their lives simultaneously. But we'll get to that. If you enjoy stories like this, stories about patience, precision, and watching karma operate like a Swiss watch, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to hear how I took it all back. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know who's awake with me right now, because this is the kind of story you don't tell at 2 in the afternoon. This is a midnight story. Part 1. What 8 years actually looks like. Let me paint you a picture of what 8 years of your life looks like when you hand it to a family business. It looks like leaving your apartment at 5:47 a.m. on a Monday morning in January to drive 40 minutes to a job site in the rain because the general contractor called at 5:15 saying the concrete subcontractor didn't show up and someone needed to be there to manage the situation before the city inspector arrived at 7. It looks like $312,000 in accumulated salary that, when I ran the Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers against the median senior project manager compensation in our metro area, represented approximately $187,000 in underpayment over the same period. It looks like a 2014 Honda Accord with 118,000 miles on it, a slow leak in the rear left tire you keep meaning to fix, and a check engine light that's been on since March of 2022 that you ignore because every discretionary dollar you have goes somewhere else. It looks like sitting across a Thanksgiving table you paid for, and I mean that literally. I paid $3,200 for that Thanksgiving. The catering, the venue room rental because my parents' house wasn't large enough, the wine, the centerpieces, while your father makes a toast about how blessed he is to have such a wonderful family, and your mother squeezes your brother Darius's hand while he grins with the easy confidence of someone who has never once been told the word no in a context that actually cost him anything. I need you to understand something about Darius before we go any further, because the temptation when telling a story like this is to make the antagonist a cartoon, a buffoon. And Darius is not unintelligent. That would actually be easier to explain. Darius is charming the way that a brochure is charming. Beautiful, compelling, completely hollow, and designed entirely to get you to spend money. He is 34 years old. In those 34 years, he has dropped out of 2 universities, Georgia State and later an online program through a school I will not name because they would arguably have grounds to complain about the association, launched 3 businesses, a streetwear brand, a sports bar concept, and something he described as a curated sneaker investment fund that I still don't fully understand, accumulated gambling debts that I would later discover totaled $218,000, driven no fewer than 4 cars purchased by my parents, including his current vehicle, a 2023 Audi Q8 in Manhattan Midnight Black that retails at $71,200, and worked for Caldwell and Sons Contracting for a combined total of 11 weeks across 2 separate attempts, both of which ended with him announcing that corporate structure wasn't his vibe. I, meanwhile, had been there since I was 22 years old. I want you to understand the architecture of what my father promised me, because this is where the legal matter becomes interesting, and I want you to have the full picture. In 2016, when I graduated from Georgia Tech with a degree in construction management and a minor in business administration, my father, Raymond Caldwell, sat me down at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where I'd done homework as a kid, where my mother made her Sunday biscuits, the whole sentimental geography of it very much intentional, and he made me what he described as the offer of a lifetime. The company, he explained, was doing approximately $1.8 million in annual revenue at that point. It needed infrastructure. It needed someone who understood project management systems, compliance frameworks, client relationship management. It needed, in his words, someone who could take this thing to the next level. He said he'd been watching me, that he was proud of me, that I was the one who got it. The offer: I would come on as a project manager at $52,000 a year, roughly 60% of market rate, with the understanding that upon his retirement, which he projected would occur in approximately 8 to 10 years, I would receive a 40% ownership stake in the company as equity compensation for the below-market salary I would be accepting during my tenure. He did not put this in writing. I'm going to give you a moment to sit with that sentence. He did not put this in writing. I was 22 years old. I was proud of my father. I believed in the company, and I believed in him. I shook his hand across that kitchen table, and I said yes. What I did not know at 22, that I know now at 30, is that a verbal promise of equity compensation, under the right legal framework, is not necessarily worthless. It is not the ironclad written agreement you want, but depending on your jurisdiction, depending on what you can document, depending on how many years of below-market salary you can quantify and connect directly back to that promise, it is not nothing. It took me 8 years to learn that, but I'm a fast learner.
Building
once
the
I'm
empire they would try to take. Here is what I actually did for Caldwell & Sons Contracting between 2016 and 2024. In year 1, I implemented a project management software system. I won't name the specific platform for contractual reasons, but it's one of the top 3 in the construction industry that replaced my father's handwritten ledger system and a collection of Excel spreadsheets that hadn't been updated since 2011. The implementation cost $14,000, which came out of my personal savings because my father said the budget wasn't there, and I believed in the project enough to invest. I have the receipts. I always kept the receipts, even before I understood why I was keeping them. That software system improved our scheduling efficiency by approximately 34% in the first year, as measured by on-time project completion rates, which went from 61% to 82%. I have the before and after data. I have the client satisfaction surveys I designed and implemented. I have everything. By year 2, I had restructured our vendor relationships and renegotiated contracts with our top 6 material suppliers, reducing our cost of goods on an average residential project by approximately 12%. On a company doing $1.8 million in revenue with material costs representing roughly 40% of project budgets, that is not an insignificant number. By year 3, I had developed a commercial contracting division that didn't exist before I arrived. I spent 14 months building the client pipeline for that division, attending industry events, developing RFP response templates, establishing relationships with 2 commercial real estate development firms in the metro area. That division generated $340,000 in its first full year of operation. I built it from nothing. By year 6, Caldwell & Sons was doing $4.1 million in annual revenue. By year 8, we were at $5.2 million. The company that my father had been running as a modest residential contractor, the company I was being paid $67,000 a year to help grow, I know, he'd given me a few raises. Let's talk about what those raises looked like in context. Was now a $5.2 million enterprise, and every significant piece of operational infrastructure it ran on was something I had built. The raises, by the way, in 8 years, my salary went from $52,000 to $74,000.
Total compensation over 8 years, approximately $496,000. The BLS median salary for a senior project manager in construction in our metro area over that same period, adjusted for the seniority level I was operating at by year 4, approximately $683,000. The delta, the number that represents what I accepted below market value in exchange for that equity promise, is $187,000, and I want you to remember that number. Meanwhile, Darius received direct cash transfers from my parents that I would later document, totaling $94,000 over the same period, a vehicle purchase in 2019, $43,000 Audi A5, a vehicle purchase in 2022, the $71,200 Q8, rent payments on his midtown apartment for approximately 26 months, totaling an estimated $41,600, and the item that would eventually break everything open, a loan from my parents, structured through a document I found in a drawer I was never supposed to open, that paid off $218,000 of Darius's gambling debts in 2021. I found that document on a Wednesday evening in March of 2024. I was at my parents' house helping my mother troubleshoot her printer. She'd asked me to look in the filing cabinet in the home office for a specific insurance document. The insurance document was there. So was a manila folder labeled with my father's careful handwriting, D, Settlement Agreement, Confidential. I am a senior project manager. My entire professional life is documentation, file management, and pattern recognition. I read the contents of that folder in approximately 4 minutes. I put it back exactly as I found it. I walked to my mother's printer, fixed the paper jam that was causing the problem, and said, "You're all set, Mom. Just needed to clear the tray." She made me a cup of coffee and asked how work was going. I said work was great, which from a certain angle was true, because work was about to get very interesting.
I want to be precise about what I did in the 6 weeks between finding that document and the night of the gala, because I think the details matter. This was not reactive. This was not emotional. This was a project, and I managed it the way I manage every project, with a timeline, deliverables, and contingency planning. Week 1, documentation gathering. I began systematically pulling every piece of written communication, text messages, emails, voicemails that I had with my father over 8 years that referenced, directly or indirectly, the equity promise. There were more than I expected. My father was not a sophisticated operator when it came to digital communications. There were text messages from 2017 saying things like, "You're the one who keeps this thing running. Don't worry, son, your investment will pay off." There were emails, actual emails, which are significantly more useful from an evidentiary standpoint than text messages, from 2019 and 2021, in which my father referenced the arrangement we discussed when you came on, and the stake you've been earning. Not a contract, but not nothing. I saved everything to an encrypted folder on a personal cloud account that had no connection to any company device or network. Week 2, I retained an attorney. I'm not going to name her, but she is a business litigation specialist with 22 years of experience and a particular expertise in promissory estoppel claims. If you're not familiar with promissory estoppel, here's the short version. It is a legal doctrine that says if someone makes you a promise, you rely on that promise to your detriment, meaning you do something you wouldn't have otherwise done, like accept 8 years of below market salary, and it would be unjust to allow them to break that promise. A court can enforce it, even in the absence of a written contract. It is not a guaranteed win. My attorney was very clear about that, but with the documentation I had, she said we had a viable claim. She also told me something that changed my entire strategy. "Marcus, before you file anything, I want you to understand what your father is about to do, because if he does what I think he's going to do, you're going to have a much stronger case, and you're going to have a lot more leverage." I asked her what she meant. She said, "He's going to give that company to your brother without compensating you. And when he does that in front of witnesses on a documented occasion with a paper trail we can follow, that's when we move." I said, "He has a retirement gala in 6 weeks." She said, "Perfect." Week 3 through 5, the forensic accounting.
I worked with a CPA my attorney referred me to. This woman was extraordinary, I want to be clear. She found things I didn't even know I was looking for, and we conducted what I can only describe as a forensic reconstruction of the company's financials as they related to my contributions versus total company growth. We built a model that quantified, as specifically as the available data would allow, the value I had added to the business through the commercial build-out build, the operational infrastructure, the vendor renegotiations, the project management systems, and the revenue growth trajectory. We also, and this is where the document I found in my parents' filing cabinet became significant, traced the source of the $218,000 settlement payment to Darius. I'm going to be careful here about what I say publicly, but I will tell you that a portion of that payment traced back to company accounts in a manner that was, according to my CPA, not consistent with standard business expense classification and would require explanation to any competent auditor. By week 5, I had a 47-page document. It included a timeline of the equity promise and all documented evidence of its existence, a quantified analysis of my below-market compensation totaling $187,000 in underpayment, a valuation analysis supporting a minimum equity claim worth, at the current appraised company value, $2.08 million, 40% of $5.2 million, the documented transfers to Darius totaling over $460,000 across all categories, and the financial irregularities related to the settlement payment. I also had something else, something I discovered during the documentation phase that my attorney found particularly interesting. The building. Caldwell & Sons Construction operated out of a commercial property, offices plus a small equipment yard that my father had been leasing for 11 years from a private landlord, an older gentleman named Mr. Beaumont, who had been trying, with increasing urgency, to sell the building for the past 3 years. I knew this because I handled the lease renewals. I knew what the property was worth, $1.1 million, recently appraised. I knew what Mr. Beaumont's asking price was, $980,000. He wanted liquidity more than maximum value. And I knew that my father had twice declined the opportunity to purchase it, citing capital allocation priorities. In week 4, I called Mr. Beaumont directly. I told him I was interested in discussing a private purchase. We met for coffee. We agreed on $965,000. I had $310,000 in savings, the product of 8 years of living well below my means, while my brother burned through cash like it was a renewable resource. I obtained a commercial mortgage for the remaining $665,000 through a lender my attorney's CPA contact referred me to. The deal closed quietly, with Mr. Beaumont's cooperation, 4 days before the gala. Caldwell & Sons Contracting was now operating out of a building I owned. My father did not know this. Week 6, preparation. I printed 12 copies of a condensed version of the 47-page document, 8 pages, the essential elements, clean and readable, and placed them in 12 sealed envelopes. I also prepared a 1-page summary sheet, formatted clearly, the kind of thing that a person can absorb in 90 seconds. I placed one envelope in the breast pocket of my suit. I placed the other 11 in my car. I drove to the gala.
Everything changed. The Caldwell & Sons 30th Anniversary and Retirement Gala was held at the Meridian Club, a private event space in Buckhead that runs approximately $8,500 for a Saturday evening rental. I know this because I negotiated the contract and my father had signed off on billing it to the company as a client appreciation and marketing event. There were 200 guests, approximately half of whom were genuine business contacts and clients, and half of whom were family friends, and community members my parents had invited. I arrived at 6:30 p.m., 90 minutes before the formal program began. I was wearing a charcoal Tom Ford suit that I had purchased in 2021 and reserved for occasions that warranted it. I walked the room. I greeted clients. I spoke with 3 of our commercial real estate partners. I was, by every external measure, completely fine. Darius arrived at 7:15 with his wife, Simone. I want to remember Simone specifically because she becomes important later, wearing a new suit I didn't recognize and his perpetual expression of comfortable confidence. He hugged my mother. He shook hands with clients he'd met once and introduced himself as part of the family leadership team, which was, as of that evening, factually inaccurate and was about to become definitively, legally, and publicly inaccurate.
My father took the stage at 8:45. I want to describe the moment before he spoke because I want you to understand the feeling of standing in a room where you know something that everyone else is about to discover. It is very quiet inside you. The room itself is loud, the clink of glasses, the ambient conversation, the soft band in the corner wrapping up their last song. But inside you, there is this strange, still silence. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of a compressed spring. My father adjusted the microphone and smiled at the room the way he always smiled at rooms, with the easy warmth of a man who has never had to question whether he deserved the warmth that came back to him. He talked about 30 years. He talked about building something from nothing, starting with a pickup truck and a phone book, which is true and which I had always respected. He talked about his wife, my mother, Sandra, who was seated at the head table in a blue dress and who was crying lightly in the way she does at all significant occasions. He thanked his loyal clients and employees. He thanked his community. And then he said, "But most of all, I want to talk about legacy." I set down my champagne flute. "Legacy," he said, "is what you leave behind. And I am so proud, so genuinely, deeply proud to announce that as of tonight, I am transferring full ownership of Caldwell & Sons Contracting to the man who I know will carry it forward with the same heart and passion I poured into it for 30 years. He turned, extended his arm toward the table where Darius was sitting. My son, my legacy, Darius Caldwell. The applause filled the room. Darius stood up, beaming. My mother was crying fully now. 15 feet away, I was straightening my jacket. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The room was still mostly in applause, but the people near me noticed me stand, and the stillness spread outward in a wave, the way stillness does when someone stands up in a context where standing up means something. My father saw me. His smile remained for approximately 2 seconds, the smile of a man who assumes the standing is celebratory, and then his eyes read something in my expression that changed his face. "Dad," I said, and I want you to understand that I said it clearly but quietly, the way you might address someone at a business meeting when you need the room's attention but don't want to signal alarm. "Before we continue, I just have a few things I'd like to share with our guests." I walked to the front of the room. I reached into my breast pocket and removed the envelope. Behind me, I could hear my father say, softly, "Marcus." I held up one hand, not dismissively, just one moment. "My name is Marcus Caldwell," I addressed the room. "I've worked for Caldwell & Sons Contracting for 8 years. For most of you who are clients or partners, I'm the person you've worked with on your projects. I'm glad you're all here tonight because I think you deserve to know some things about the company you've trusted and about 8 years of work actually looks like." I opened the envelope. I removed the first sheet. On November 14th, 2016, my father made a verbal offer of employment at $52,000 per year, approximately 60% of the median market rate for my role, with the explicit promise of a 40% ownership upon his retirement. I accepted. I built the commercial contracting division that generated $340,000 in its first year. I implemented operational systems that increased on-time project completion by 34%. I grew this company from $18 million in annual revenue to $5.2 million. I placed the first sheet face up on the nearest table. And tonight, my father announced he is giving the company to my brother Darius, who has worked here for a combined 11 weeks in 8 years. The room was, and I want to use this word with full precision, silent. Not the polite listening audience of an attentive audience, the deafening silence of 200 people who have stopped breathing. I continued. I have documentation of my father's promise to me, including written communications in which he explicitly acknowledges the arrangement. I have a forensic accounting analysis quantifying my below-market compensation at $187,000. I have a valuation of the 40% stake I was promised at the current appraised company value of $5.2 million, which would be $2.08 million. And I have documentation of approximately $460,000 in financial transfers to my brother over the same 8-year period, including a $218,000 payment that resolved gambling debts traced in part to company accounts. My father made a sound. I don't know how to describe it precisely. It was the sound of a man discovering that the room has already shifted and he does not control it anymore. I turned to address the 11 tables closest to me. My assistant, Brianna, who had known nothing about the contents of the envelopes but had agreed as a professional courtesy to help me distribute materials during what I'd described to her as a brief presentation, was moving quietly around the perimeter of the room. She placed an envelope at each of those 11 tables. Inside those envelopes, I said, is a condensed version of the full report, which runs 47 pages and has been reviewed by a business litigation attorney and a certified forensic accountant. Copies of the complete document have been filed with our attorney. A civil complaint for promissory estoppel, breach of implied contract, and unjust enrichment has been filed in Fulton County Superior Court as of 9 a.m. yesterday morning. I paused. Case number is on page 1 of the document if anyone wishes to verify. I looked at my father. "I'm not angry, Dad," I said, "and I want you to know this was true. I'm just done." I picked up my champagne glass from the table beside me. I turned back to the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight. The shrimp cocktail is excellent. I recommend it."
What silence sounds like when it breaks. The silence lasted approximately 8 seconds. I counted. Then it broke, and it broke the way ice breaks on a river in spring, not gradually, but all at once, in multiple places simultaneously, each crack distinct and each one connected to all the others. My father was the first to speak. He was at the microphone, and he had the expression of a man who has spent 30 years being the most important person in any room he entered and has just, in the space of 4 minutes, ceased to be that person. He said my name. Just my name, Marcus, the way you say a word when you're testing whether it still works, when you're not sure the language you've always spoken still applies. My mother stood up. She was saying something I couldn't fully hear, directed at me, and there were tears on her face, but they were different from the happy tears of 2 minutes ago. These were the tears of someone who has been caught, which is a very specific kind of crying that looks a lot like grief, but is actually something else entirely. Darius was sitting very still. His wife Simone was sitting very still next to him. They were not looking at each other. Simone was looking at the envelope that had been placed on their table. She had picked it up and was holding it, not opened, just held, with the particular grip of someone taking inventory of what they're holding before they decide what to do with it. One of our commercial clients, a real estate developer named Paul Eccles, who has been working with us since I built the commercial division, caught my eye from across the room. He nodded at me, a small nod. I nodded back. Paul is a man who has spent 30 years reading rooms and people. He'd read this one. The formal program was clearly over. What followed was approximately 40 minutes of the most operatically uncomfortable social experience I have ever witnessed, and I say witnessed deliberately because I was emotionally, at that point, outside of it. I was watching it the way you watch a film you wrote. You're invested, but you're also already past it. My father found his way to me within the first 10 minutes. He was, and I want to be careful to be accurate here, not the version of my father who had spoken from that podium. He was smaller somehow. He was speaking quietly and quickly, the words coming in a rush, and the words were some combination of "this wasn't the right time," and "you don't understand the full picture," and "we can sit down and talk about this privately," and "your brother needs this more than you think." I said, "Dad, this conversation needs to happen through attorneys now. I'll have mine contact yours." He stared at me. I think he was waiting for something to break in my face, some old reflex of deference, the habituated response of the reliable son who keeps it together so the family doesn't fracture.
It didn't come. I said, "I love you, I genuinely do, but this is over." My aunt, my father's sister, appeared at my elbow approximately 20 minutes into the fallout. Aunt Reva, who has been the family's social barometer for as long as I've been alive, who knows everyone in our community, who is on the stewardship committee at First Redeemer Baptist and has been for 15 years. She took my arm and steered me gently toward a corner. I expected a lecture. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "I knew something was wrong with the way they were treating you. I've known for years." Then she squeezed my arm and walked away. I noticed over the course of the next 40 minutes that the client half of the room was behaving very differently from the family half. The clients and business contacts were departing, politely, efficiently, with the particular purposefulness of people who have processed information and are going somewhere to discuss it privately. Several of them stopped to shake my hand on the way out. Paul Eccles stopped and said, "My attorneys will be in touch with yours. I have ongoing project commitments and I want to make sure there's continuity," which was, in the language of commercial real estate development, the most significant expression of confidence he could offer. The family half of the room was conducting a series of fractured, overlapping conversations that had the texture of emergency management, the kind of collective processing that happens when a narrative that everyone has been living inside for years is suddenly, publicly, and irrevocably revealed to be false. Simone, Darius's wife, left the gala at approximately 9:30 p.m. I watched her collect her wrap from the coat check, speak briefly and quietly to Darius, and leave. He tried to follow her, and she put up one hand, in the same gesture I'd used with my father, and he stopped. I want to be honest about this part. I did not feel satisfaction at Simone's departure. Simone had married my brother in good faith. Whatever she was processing that night, it was not a problem she had created, and watching someone absorb that kind of information, that the person they've built a life with has been sustained by a kind of financial parasitism that they may not have fully understood, that is not something I took pleasure in. I note it because it happened. It is part of the story,
Part
but it
6,
was not
the
a
morning
victory I
after
was
and the
counting.
months after. I want to skip forward slightly because the immediate aftermath of the gala was mostly noise, and noise is not the interesting part. The interesting part is the architecture. My attorney filed the motion the morning after the gala. We had already prepared it. The gala had provided the public documentation of the equity transfer that we needed. The complaint named my father individually and Caldwell & Sons Contracting as defendants and alleged promissory estoppel, unjust enrichment, breach of implied contract, and, based on the financial irregularities in the settlement payment, potential breach of fiduciary duty. My father retained an attorney within 48 hours. The first letter from his attorney arrived 6 days later and was, I'll put this diplomatically, confident. It characterized my claims as without merit, denied the existence of any enforceable equity promise, and suggested that my below-market compensation had been fully offset by the professional development opportunities provided during my tenure. The phrase learning experience appeared in that letter, and I mention it specifically because it appeared in a document that I will be referring to in court, and it remains one of the most expensive phrases my father's legal team has written. The building situation became apparent to them within the first 30 days. My father's attorney sent a letter regarding the lease renewal for the Caldwell & Sons operating property, and my attorney responded with documentation of the purchase. I am now the landlord of the building that houses the company that was built substantially on my work. The current monthly rent per the existing lease is $6,800. The lease renews in 14 months. The renewal terms will be negotiated at that time. I want to be transparent about the litigation because I don't think it's resolved in the clean, cinematic way that makes for a satisfying 3-sentence summary. The case is ongoing as of the time I'm telling this story. What I can tell you is that my attorney considers our position strong, that the documentation of the equity promise, specifically those emails in which my father acknowledged the arrangement, has been characterized by opposing counsel in a way that suggests they know it's damaging, and that the financial irregularities have been referred to the appropriate authorities for review.
I can also tell you that 3 of our 5 largest commercial clients have contacted me directly to express their intention to follow whatever professional direction I take, which has certain implications for the company's valuation in any settlement negotiation. Settlement conversations have begun. I'm not going to discuss the numbers because the matter is pending and my attorney would correctly tell me not to. But I will tell you that the conversation has moved from "your claims are without merit" to "let's find a mutually beneficial resolution," which in legal translation means "we have read your documentation and
What
we
the
have
family looks like
concerns."
now. I want to talk about this section carefully because these are still my parents, and I want to be honest without being gratuitous. My relationship with my father is suspended, is the word I'd use. There is a legal matter pending. We do not speak directly. Through my mother, I have received communication that he is deeply hurt by how I handled the situation, which I'll acknowledge has a complicated texture. The man who made an 8-year promise and then publicly broke it in front of 200 people is hurt by the manner in which I responded. I understand the emotional logic of that, even if the moral logic is less persuasive. My mother and I have spoken twice since the gala. These were difficult conversations. My mother she is a woman who has spent 40 years of her life building a narrative about her family, and I think the gala was the night that narrative was forcibly revised. She loves me. I believe that without reservation. She also, for reasons I've spent a lot of time trying to understand, made choices about Darius that were ultimately at the expense of me, and those choices have consequences that she is now living with. I have compassion for her. I also have an attorney, and those two things coexist. Darius and Simone are, as of my last reliable information, separated. I don't have precise details, and I don't want them. What I know is that Simone is a person of considerable personal integrity who, upon reviewing the contents of that envelope, made decisions that reflected that integrity. I wish her well. Darius I've been told he is struggling. I've been told this by my aunt, by a cousin, by 2 people from church who called my mother and whose calls I heard about secondhand. I'm going to say something that might surprise you. I don't want Darius to suffer. I never wanted Darius to suffer. What I wanted, what I still want, is for the accounting to be honest, for the value I created to be acknowledged and compensated, for the promise that was made to me to be honored, or, failing that, for the court to calculate what honoring it would have looked like and assign a number to it. What Darius does with his own life after that accounting is his business. What has surprised me more in the aftermath is the community dimension. My parents were prominent members of First Redeemer Baptist. They were known, respected, on committees. In the months since the gala, I've heard from Aunt Riva, who remains the most reliable social barometer I have access to, that several people have become noticeably cooler, that the invitations have thinned, that certain conversations at certain social events have gone quiet when my parents approached. Small things, the kind of things that are not dramatic in the moment and are devastating over time. I did not orchestrate this. I want to be clear about that. I showed people documentation of what happened. What they did with that documentation was their choice. People, it turns out, have strong feelings about watching a family betray someone who built the thing they're all benefiting from. This is not a revenge I planned. It is simply what happens when the truth becomes visible.
I am writing this from my apartment, a different apartment than the one I was in at the start of this story, because after the gala, I made some decisions about how I wanted to live, and one of them was that I was done operating at a reduced scale while other people operated at my expense. The apartment is good. I have a couch I actually like. I have a car that doesn't have a check engine light on. I've been thinking a lot in the months since this happened about what I would tell the version of myself who sat across that kitchen table in 2016 and shook my father's hand. I think about him with a lot of compassion because he was acting from love and from hope and from the particular vulnerability of being someone who genuinely wanted to believe that the people closest to you would treat you with the same integrity you brought to them. The version of myself I am now would tell him, get it in writing. Not because everyone you love is going to betray you, but because written agreements protect the relationship, not just the deal. Because when you make it formal, you make it real, and you make it respectful, and you give both parties something to point to when things get complicated. Get it in writing. Not because you don't trust him. Get it in writing because you respect the promise enough to want it to be permanent. He wouldn't listen to me, probably. He was 22, and he was proud of his father, and he wanted to believe. But I'm telling you anyway. The other thing I would tell him is this. The skills you develop, the systems you build, the relationships you cultivate, those are yours. No one can transfer those away. No one can sign those over to a brother in a speech at a gala. The thing that made the company worth $5.2 million is not in the articles of incorporation. It's in the 14,000 hours I spent building it. And those hours went with me when I left. I have a consulting practice now, running independently, and I have 3 of the 5 commercial clients I developed at Caldwell & Sons who have followed me. I have a building that generates monthly cash flow. I have a legal case that is proceeding in a direction I'm confident about. And I have, finally, the absolute clarity that comes from knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you're worth, because you've done the forensic accounting on yourself and the number is real and the receipts are in order. I had a conversation recently with Paul Eccles, the developer, over coffee. We were discussing a potential project. At the end of the conversation, unprompted, he said, "You know, I watched you at that gala. A lot of people would have come in swinging. You came in organized." He said it with a kind of respect that I've thought about since. Organized is not glamorous, but organized
I
is what
couldn't have
wins.
planned. There is one thing that happened in the aftermath of the gala that I didn't plan, and that I find, in retrospect, to be the most significant element of the whole story. About 6 weeks after the gala, I received a text message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. A former colleague from Georgia Tech, Dominique, who'd gone on to work for a mid-size commercial development firm. She'd heard about what had happened. This had traveled further than I expected. It turns out 200 people at a high-profile event in a professional community is not a small sample. And she sent me a message that said, "I heard what you built and how they handled it. I'd like to have coffee if you're open to it." We had coffee. 3 hours. We talked about the construction industry, about project management systems, about the commercial development pipeline in the metro area. Her firm, it turned out, was looking for a development partnership on 2 mixed-use projects that would have a combined value in development of approximately $12 million. That conversation is ongoing. Those projects are in early-stage feasibility. Nothing is signed yet, and I'm not going to speculate about outcomes. But I want to tell you that because I think it's the part of the story that the revenge narrative framework almost misses. The point was never to destroy my father's company, or to humiliate my family, or to win a lawsuit. The point was to not disappear. The point was to refuse to let 8 years of real work become invisible just because someone with a pen decided it should be. What I built is visible. What I'm building now is visible, and the people who are worth working with can see it.
Family isn't about blood. I used to believe that was a cynical thing to say, a thing bitter people tell themselves when relationships fracture. I don't believe that anymore. I think it is one of the more honest things you can say about human connection. Blood is the starting condition. It is not the definition. The definition is what you do with it. The definition is whether the people who carry the same last name as you will tell you the truth, honor what they promised you, and treat your contribution as real, not as a learning experience, not as a convenient source of low-cost labor, not as the predictable reliability of someone who will never leave because they were raised to believe loyalty is unconditional. Loyalty should be conditional. It should be conditional on honesty, on fairness, on the willingness of the people you're loyal to be loyal back. Otherwise, it's not loyalty. It's just a habit. My father spent 30 years building a company. That is genuinely admirable. He built it with a pickup truck and a phone book, and the grit required to do that is real, and I do not dismiss it. He also spent 8 years accepting my contributions while quietly planning to give what those contributions built to someone else. Both of those things are true, and I hold both of them. I'm not done being his son. I'm done being his employee, his financial infrastructure, his convenient answer to the question of who's going to make this work. But the man who taught me how to read a blueprint and how to shake a client's hand and how to show up when you said you would, I carry that person with me every day, even now. I just also carry a 47-page document, 3 commercial client contracts, a property deed, and an attorney on
And I
retainer.
want you to actually think about it before you answer. If you were in my shoes, 8 years, $187,000 in underpayment, a broken promise, a brother who never showed up getting everything you built, what would you have done? A. Forgiven them, preserved the family, walked away from the equity claim? B. Sued for every penny, the building, the audit, the works, exactly what I did? C. Walked away completely. No lawsuit, no gala confrontation, just left and started over somewhere they couldn't find you. Let me know in the comments. Tell me where you're from and what time it is where you are, and tell me which one of those choices you could actually live with. Not which one sounds right, but which one you could wake up with at 3 a.m. 10 years from now and know you chose yourself. Because that's the only question that matters. I'm Marcus, I'm 30 years old, and I'm just getting started.